Edgefield County, South Carolina, 1846. The Lambert plantation rose from the rice marsh like a verdict, 2 stories of Georgian symmetry, white columns bright as teeth, windows that watched more than they ever let on. Everyone in the county knew the name. They praised its yields, whispered about its punishments, and stepped lightly when conversation wandered near its past. Donovan Lambert had built it in 1798, with ambition for mortar and cruelty for nails. For nearly 50 years he squeezed cotton and rice from over 200 enslaved people, and if anyone objected, they learned quickly how silence tasted. By the time he died in 1845 at 72, he had a fortune, a reputation, and a family that had learned to keep its face still. The ledger books balanced, the souls did not. His widow, Estella Lambert, moved through the main house like a ghost who refused to admit she was dead. She wore her grief the way she wore her lace, properly, neatly, without allowing even a tremor to show. At 58, she had been shaped by a long marriage to a man who mistook fear for order. Widowhood let the air back into her lungs, but not enough to teach her how to breathe. To their only legitimate son, Craig, Donovan left everything. Craig was 28 and freshly returned from northern schools, carrying books, manners, and a mind that fancied itself improved by travel. He believed in cleaner quarters for the enslaved people, better rations, less lash, small mercies that cost him nothing and let him feel modern. He wrote letters in a fine hand and told himself he was not his father. It was Craig who noticed her. She was called Lena. 19. Quick with a tray and quicker with a glance that made a person feel seen, if only for a heartbeat. She worked in the main house under Estella's eye, polishing silver until the spoons shone like thin moons. The older women said she had arrived as a child from Charleston. They did not say how such things happened. The buying, the naming, the small erasures that turned a person into property. They did not have to. On plantations, truth didn't need a voice. It had a smell. Craig asked for tea more often that autumn. He found reasons to be in rooms where Lena already knew exactly where the dust hid. He discovered the satisfaction of speaking to someone who listened, like the world depended on getting the words right. He discussed weather patterns as if they were philosophy, yields as if they were poetry. He told himself the conversations were harmless. He told himself many things. Estella saw it. Mothers do. She shifted doorways, altered schedules, invented errands that moved Lena from the drawing room to the laundry, then to the pantry, then out to the steps where the house's shadow ended and the yard began. She watched Craig's eyes follow. She offered gentle admonitions wrapped in propriety. Remember yourself, think of the household, we must not invite talk. She did not say the other words that trembled at the edge of her mouth. Some words once spoken cannot be put back into their cage. In the quarters behind the kitchen lived Mammy Eliza, 58 and weathered by more births than she cared to count. She had practiced midwifery with hands steadier than most doctors and a memory that ran deeper than the well. If the main house kept records, Eliza kept histories. She had learned long ago to hold them close. When she saw Craig begin to orbit Lena like a moth, certain the flame meant warmth, Eliza felt a familiar pressure in her chest. A warning. She told herself the boy would lose interest, that the season would pass, that this was the old story wearing a new coat. She told herself staying quiet might keep worse things from waking. Lena moved through the days with precision and a delicate dignity that refused to be broken. She did her tasks. She kept her distance. She smiled the kind of smile that meant survival, not invitation. But power on a plantation was a shape that pressed in from all sides, and the corridors of the main house were very narrow. By winter, Craig had learned the sound of Lena's step on the back stair. By winter, Estella had stopped setting 2 place settings for tea when she heard him coming. The house held its breath the night it began. It was late, rain chattering at the windows, lamps throwing small puddles of gold on polished wood. Craig appeared at the doorway to the scullery, with a request about ledgers he could have made to any servant. Lena set down a stack of folded linens. They looked at each other just a second too long. He said her name. She lowered her eyes. The silence between them was a bridge. They crossed it. After that, Craig invented errands like a man invents prayers, believing that if he repeats them often enough, someone will answer. The meetings multiplied. Words became touch. Touch became ritual. Lena stood inside the impossible arithmetic of a world that called her property, and then asked for her heart. Consent on a plantation had no clean place to stand. Only the shifting ground of power and the quiet calculations of a woman trying to survive another day. Estella tightened her interventions, but she could not be everywhere. She confronted Craig once, alone, voice cool, eyes bright. He parried with the confidence of a son who believed in his own goodness. He spoke of feeling, of intention, of how different he was from his father. Estella listened and felt the past crack its knuckles. Eliza watched and waited. She watched Craig's footsteps grow predictable. Estella's hands tremble when she thought no one could see. Lena's gaze drift toward the horizon, as if it knew the weather there. She waited for the moment she had prayed would not come. The morning when Lena, pale and careful, came to her with a hand on her belly and a question lodged in her throat. Eliza knew before the words were out. The knowledge didn't arrive clean. It dragged shadows with it. She had been there 19 years earlier, when a girl named Sarah labored and died in a room that smelled of lye and candle smoke. She had seen a newborn's face that wore the wrong man's eyes. She had wrapped that baby and whispered the only blessing she could manage. She had watched Donovan Lambert's attention linger too long, then watched him sell the child at 8 years old to scrub the ledger of a sin a sale could not erase. She had kept her mouth closed because survival required it, because truth told at the wrong time was a knife with no handle. Now the child had returned as a young woman, with a hand on her belly. Eliza's breath shortened. She disguised it with a cough, poured water, and asked gentle questions that listened to the answers and to the silences inside them. When Lena left, Eliza sat a long while on the stool by her small window, watching a line of ants move with perfect obedience along the wall. She knew what the past was trying to do. It was reaching up through the floorboards, pulling at the ankles of the living. Craig reacted to the news as if he had been given a miracle and a crown. He spoke in plans. Freedom papers, arrangements, a future imagined with the arrogance of a man who had never been told a door was locked. He did not understand that the law did not care for his intentions. He did not understand that some chains are forged in legislature and custom, not only in iron. Estella understood. She knew how the town spoke when it thought it was whispering. She knew how men like the sheriff handled information that threatened families like hers. She knew that if this child came, nothing would stay where it had been placed. She considered 100 strategies and found every one of them led back to the same precipice. The house grew quieter as the months turned. Lena's duties shifted under the explanation of delicate health. The enslaved people in the yard pretended not to notice what everyone noticed. The overseer learned to ask fewer questions. Craig divided his time between devotion and calculation. Estella prayed more than she had in 20 years. Eliza gathered herbs, lint, thread, and strength. At night, the main house creaked, as if the wood were trying to speak. When the first storm of September dragged its dark hem over the fields, Lena's pains began early. Eliza was called to the room at the back of the second floor, where the wind pressed its damp hands against the glass. Estella took her place by the bed, smoothing hair, whispering psalms. Craig paced the hall until the floor remembered the pattern of his footsteps. The hours lengthened. The screams came and went like tides. Eliza felt the wrongness before she saw it. The baby was not turning as it should. Blood said things no one wanted to hear. She set her jaw, did what her hands had learned to do, and kept moving. When at last the child crowned, Eliza caught her breath. The head was misshapen. The limbs told a story that had been written in another room decades ago. She did not cry out. She did not let her hands shake. She lifted the child, and in the small pause between one heartbeat and the next, she understood that the past had finished its terrible circle. In the hallway, Craig stopped pacing. In the room, Estella's prayer faltered. On the bed, Lena reached for a future that was already sinking. Eliza wrapped the newborn and made a choice. To speak now or to hold the truth a little longer. To save what could be saved or shatter it all at once. Outside, thunder rolled across the marsh. Inside, the house did not breathe. The storm loosened its grip on the house just before dawn, leaving the windows filmed with salt and the air heavy, like a chapel after incense. In the back room, the candle flames trembled and then steadied. The child did not. Eliza knew from the first breath, thin, splayed, unwilling, that life would come and go like a skittish bird. She wrapped the boy in a clean cloth and did not meet Estella's eyes. Lena reached with a mother's blind certainty. Estella caught her wrists gently, the way you catch a falling cup. "Let me," Lena whispered, voice raw. "Please." Eliza lowered the bundle into her arms. There are moments when truth must wait at the threshold. This was one. Lena stared and the world tilted. Her mouth opened, but sound broke into pieces. She rocked once, twice, as if motion could sand the edges from what she saw. Then a small animal sound escaped her. Nothing like a human sob, nothing like a word. Estella's fingers tightened over linen until her knuckles showed through. In the hallway, Craig's pacing stopped. He pushed through the doorway, hair uncombed, shirt half-buttoned. Hope lit behind his eyes like a lantern. The lantern went out. He stepped forward as if the floor had grown soft. Eliza watched his face learn a new language in a single second. Awe, then disbelief. Then a vertigo of questions with no place to land. "Is he—" Craig began, and could not finish. "He is," Eliza said, because lies a tinder in a house already smouldering. The child fought for air in small sips. Eliza dipped a cloth in warm water and wiped the boy's mouth, her hands moving with professional devotion, the kind reserved for the losing side. Estella began to pray in a whisper so smooth it might have been silk. The words were old, the cadence practiced, the plea sincere. Lena gathered the bundle closer as if her body could teach it how to live. She hummed a sound that had no tune, a thread thrown across a chasm. "Hush now," she said to the boy and perhaps to herself. "Hush now, hush." Minutes stretched. The candle burned down. Somewhere out in the yard, a rooster mistook the grey light for morning and declared it so. When the small chest finally stilled, it did so almost politely, like a guest who understands when to take his leave. Eliza felt the exit as a faint loosening in the air. Lena didn't feel it at first. Her arms continued the slow rhythm until the silence around her became a wall she could not push through. Craig pressed his hands over his eyes and left them there. He did not cry. He made the harder choice to look. He knelt, close enough to see the careful oddities, the way the skull did not keep its promises, the limbs that told their own miswritten gospel. He reached with a tenderness that surprised even him, and traced a finger along a jaw as if memorizing it could redeem anything. "His name," Lena said, voice hoarse. "We must give him a name," Estella swallowed. "Some names are for God alone," she murmured, but the old woman in her, the mother, could not deny the plea. "Say it then. Say it once." "Micah," Lena whispered and kissed the boy's brow. "Micah," Eliza nodded, blessing the name under her breath. She took the bundle when Lena's arms finally relented and placed it in the small box a house carpenter would fashion before breakfast. There are crafts men learn for profit, and crafts they learn for sorrow. In plantations, both kinds are practiced often. By afternoon, the rain had washed the yard clean, as if a new surface could fool the ground. Craig insisted on a burial at once. Estella did not argue. Eliza walked a step behind them to the slave cemetery, a low place at the edge of the live oaks, where Spanish moss fell like faded veils. The box fit into the earth too easily. Craig read from a Bible whose pages bore the bite marks of years. His voice was steady until it was not. Then Eliza picked up the psalm and carried it to the end. They covered the box with dirt. Lena's hands hovered, useless, then clenched against her dress. When it was done, the four of them stood a long time, as if the world might offer a different ending if they only waited politely. The house did not return to itself. It took on a new silence, the kind that makes clocks seem disrespectful. Craig began a pilgrimage. Every dawn he went to the little grave and spoke to it. He spoke of cotton prices and rainfall, of the books he had read and the books he now suspected of lying. He drew diagrams in a notebook, crooked limbs rendered as geometry, skull plates as if studying angles could soothe. He wrote letters to physicians in Charleston and Savannah, asking questions medicine had not yet learned how to entertain. He ended them with gratitude and his full name, as if courtesy could bribe fate. Estella let the house run on habit. She set tables, gave orders, adjusted flowers that died faster than they should. At night, sleep came like a thief and took nothing. Guilt walked the corridor outside her door, and she counted its steps, wondering which moment, which sentence, which refusal had tipped this fate from possible to certain. In prayer, she found no bargains left to offer. Lena folded into herself. She ate when pressed. She listened to footsteps as if they were weather. Sometimes Eliza found her in the nursery, a room barely a nursery at all, a cradle that had not earned the name, tracing the grain of the empty crib with one finger as if reading a secret text. Sometimes she stood at the window with palms on the glass, leaving handprints like breath. Eliza carried water and words. She fed Lena broth, set cool cloths on her brow, and stitched the daylight together with small talk that asked nothing and insisted on nothing. With Craig she said very little. With Estella less. In her own room, she took out an old scrap of ribbon left from a long-ago baptism and held it until memory softened enough to release its teeth. Secrets rot when kept too long, but sometimes they are the only wood left in the fire. Days later, after a night of wind that found its way into every seam of the house, Craig cornered his mother in the study. Papers covered the desk, ledgers, letters, a drawing of a skull that looked more like a map of a country no one should visit. There must be a cause, he said. A reason. Something in the air, the water, a curse. Estella steadied her voice on the quiet edge of authority. Not every wound has a culprit you can shake by the throat. Then who? His eyes were fevered. If not a who, then a what? Estella felt the floor tilt. She could have named the what. She could have pared it down to its true size. A man's appetite, a sale, a child with the wrong eyes, a return purchased from a ledger, a summer of visits on back stairs. She saw the path her words would set alight, and the rooms it would burn through. She closed her mouth on the spark. You will rest, she said instead. You will eat. You will remember the living who still require you. He laughed, a quick, bright sound with no humor in it. Do they? He left the room, and the house felt emptier for his absence, as if he had taken something vital with him that he did not deserve to keep. Wordless weeks accumulated. The fields needed tending, mouths needed feeding, accounts demanded signatures. Life, rude, insistent, unimpressed by tragedy, knocked and expected to be let in. The enslaved carried on in the weary miracle of endurance. They made evening fires, told jokes thin as paper, shared food that tasted better for being shared. They watched the main house become a theater of shadows and kept their heads low when those shadows moved. On a Sunday, the preacher held service under the largest oak. He spoke of Job and of the Lord's unknowable scales. He did not name the Lamberts, but the wind carried his words toward the big house anyway. Lena sat at the edge of the gathering, neither inside nor outside it. When the final hymn rose, she did not sing. That evening she knocked at Eliza's door with the softest hand. Tell me true, Lena said, not stepping in. Did I do something wrong? Did I anger God? Is there a way to make right what came of me? Eliza pulled her inside and shut the door on the corridor. The room was small, bed, trunk, a little table with a rosary, a chipped cup, a sprig of dried mint binding the air with its memory of green. Eliza took Lena's face in her hands, thumbs resting where tears would start if they had energy left to fall. Child, Eliza said, and the word carried decades. God ain't your enemy. Then who is? Eliza hesitated, tasting the old ash of choices burned long ago. She could say Donovan's name and let it do its work. She could say no name and let silence keep bleeding. Her mind laid both paths side by side and counted the dead on each. She heard steps pass in the hallway, someone light, someone practiced at not being heard. The house listened. Some wrongs were planted before you were ever seed, Eliza said at last. You tended none of them. You owe no apology for breathing. Lena closed her eyes as if the words were a compress. Will the wrongs grow again? Eliza looked at Lena's hands folded tight over her lap, the scar along one knuckle from an old kitchen knife, the line of a life written against her will. I don't know, Eliza said, and it was the truest sentence she had offered in weeks. After Lena left, Eliza sat a long time without moving. Then she rose, squared her shoulders, and went to find Estella. They met in the empty dining room where the chandelier clicked as it cooled. Candles had guttered out, leaving thin curls of smoke like questions. Estella stood at the window, a figure cut from posture and habit and turned only when Eliza spoke her name. He's asking, Eliza said. Your boy. Estella's look held both weariness and warning. He asks everyone something these days. He's asking for a ghost I've been keeping in my pocket, Eliza said, laying the words carefully on the polished table. And it's starting to bite. Estella did not sit. She placed her palm against the window pane, a gesture she had learned from loneliness. If you pull it out, it will bite us all. It's already at our throats, Eliza said gently. The two women faced each other across the length of the table. As if separated by an ocean, they were both too tired to swim. History stood between them like a third presence, a man's name neither of them wanted to pronounce, a bill of sale, a child sent away and then brought back, a summer of narrow stairs and whispered meetings. Estella's jaw worked once, twice, grinding a truth into something she might be able to swallow. "Not yet," she said. "I will not have us ripped open in the road like common gossip." Eliza bowed her head. She had served this house long enough to know a command when it came dressed as pleading. "Then pray you can carry it longer than I can." She left Estella with the window and the smoke and the long table that had hosted so many conversations pretending to be dinners. In the corridor she paused, listening. The house's timbers creaked in the settling cool. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly. Secrets moved inside the walls like mice. That night sleep found no one. Craig returned to his notebook and carved new furrows in the paper. He wrote hypotheses like confessions, confessions like hypotheses. In the margins he copied scripture, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, underlining until the text cut the page. He traced his own family tree and stopped at his father's name, as if the ink there were hot. Estella took out the black dress she had worn for Donovan's funeral. She ran her hand along the seam and remembered the sun that day, the way it had insisted on shining. She folded the dress and put it back. She had the wild thought that perhaps the house would keep its shape if she kept all the doors closed. Lena dreamed of water. In her dream, she stood at the edge of a flooded field and watched threads of cotton rise from the surface like pale eels. They wound around her wrists, soft and relentless, and pulled. She woke with the taste of river on her tongue and went to the basin to rinse it away. The face in the water looked older than she felt, younger than she knew she was allowed to be. Eliza lit a taper and placed it in the saucer she kept by the window. "For the boy," she said, and did not speak his name aloud because names invite visitors, and she was not yet ready for company. The flame flickered once and steadied. She sat on the edge of her bed and began to hum an old tune that knew how to make a room feel less empty. Morning found them all where grief leaves the living, in the middle of everything ordinary. The kettle boiled. The rooster crowed as if yesterday had taught him nothing. The overseer knocked with a head count that did not include the dead. The ledger waited with columns incapable of carrying what truly mattered, and yet, beneath the day's chores, the house continued to negotiate with its own past. It shifted, it sighed, it remembered. The whisper Eliza had carried for 19 years grew heavier, as if learning the weight of the word it would one day become. And somewhere inside Craig's unquiet mind, a different kind of resolution coalesced, not the answer he sought but a path toward it, paved with the stones of questions he could no longer bear. Before the week was out, that path would lead him to a door only one person could open. Craig found the morning before the house did. He walked its corridors while the lamps still wore their nightcaps, counting boards, noting drafts, learning which thresholds sighed and which kept their counsel. Grief had turned him into a surveyor of absences. He paused outside a narrow door near the kitchen stair, the one painted the color of old bone, the one that led to a room where truths were folded and stacked like linens. He knocked. Inside, Eliza was awake, of course. Women who usher life in and out do not sleep the way other people do. She sat at her small table with a cup of chicory and the ribbon she had once held between finger and thumb when another newborn first gulped air on this land. At Craig's knock, she closed her hand over the ribbon, as if hiding it could change what it meant. "Come," she said, and arranged her face into the shape of welcome. Craig entered and remained standing, a man who did not trust chairs. Close, Eliza could see how thin his hands had become, the skin drawn tight over knuckles bruised by scripture and stubbornness. His hair had learned the language of his nights. "I need you to tell me," he said without greeting, "what the doctors won't, what my books can't. There is a reason. I feel it like a draft under every door." Eliza gestured to the second cup she had set out without deciding for whom. "Drink." He didn't. "You were there," he pressed, voice steady only because it had been trained. "You have delivered more children than our county registers. You have seen anomalies." The word sounded surgical in his mouth, as if politer syllables could disinfect memory. "What makes a child come wrong?" Eliza held his gaze, then glanced past him at the sliver of hall where the house waited to overhear. Some houses are generous with secrets. The Lambert house had always been a miser. Sometimes the reason is a shadow we can name, she said. And sometimes it's a wind that passes through and don't leave a footprint. You want me to give you a boot print where there may be none? Craig swallowed, and for a moment the boy in him showed through the gentleman. If there is a shadow, I will not be afraid to look. Eliza believed him, which made the next thing harder. Some looking, she said softly, isn't courage. It's hunger. Color rose and left his face at once. He rubbed his jaw as if to smooth the sting. If you won't tell me, he said, then tell my mother. She will tell me. Eliza thought of the night in the dining room, the chandelier's cooling click, Estella's palm against glass like a pilgrim at a reliquary. She thought of the ribbon in her fist. She thought of 19 years of quiet that had kept a fragile order from collapsing. An order built of wrong wood, but order nonetheless. I will go to her, Eliza said at last, and Craig's shoulders loosened, not with relief but with the release of choosing a next step. People in mourning often mistake movement for improvement. He left. Eliza watched him climb the back stair like a man ascending his own sentence. Estella stood in the morning room, with her back to a dawn that was taking its time. She had opened the curtains and then decided against light. The room still smelled faintly of orange oil and dried roses, elegant forms of decay. Outside, the marsh kept its own counsel. The herons did not report to widows. When Eliza entered, Estella did not turn. Their reflection appeared together on the darkened window pane. One woman corseted by habit and grief, the other by a lifetime of being required and overlooked in equal measure. Between them, a house older than either wished to remember. He came to you, Estella said, as if continuing a conversation already halfway spent. He did, and you sent him to me. I sent him to the only person can choose whether to light this fuse. Estella inhaled, measured, exact. You are fond of metaphors this morning, Eliza. Let us try a plainer grammar. Eliza moved into the room until her words would not have to travel far. Mistress, she said, and the old title rang with all its iron. When Mr. Donovan was alive, he made mistakes the ledger can't carry. One of those mistakes came squalling in 1827 and lost her mamma before the rooster crowed. I was there. I washed the babe and I wrapped her, and I watched the master look too long. 8 years later, he sold that child out from under her name so his house would look cleaner than it was. I was there for that too. Saw the wagon. Saw the dust. Estella's fingers tightened on the back of a chair until the brocade bit her palm. This is not, it is, Eliza said not unkindly. Because before Mr. Donovan died, conscience or vanity, don't know which, made him buy back what he never should have owned. Bought her quiet-like through a trader who didn't ask questions, paid not to ask. She came back here grown. We call her Lena. The room contracted. Even the air seemed to take one step back. Estella put her other hand on the chair, not for balance but to keep from striking something she could not afford to break. Stop. The word came out thin. Then after a beat thicker, continue. I kept it in my pocket, Eliza said, tapping the apron where she sometimes hid spare buttons and bitter herbs, because saying it then would have started a fire I couldn't put out. I told myself the wind would change, that the boy would pass his fancy like a fever. Then he didn't. Then the girl was with child. And the past. She let the sentence wander to its necessary end. The past came to collect. Estella closed her eyes. Behind her lids, the house rearranged itself into an older shape. The weight of Donovan's footfall, the rude laugh, the nights when she measured safety by the direction of his breath. She saw a small girl with the wrong eyes carry a water pail too large for her hands. She saw the same mouth on two different faces and wanted to blame the mirror. You are sure, she said, needing at least the dignity of verification. I am as sure as a woman can be who caught that child with these two hands. Eliza held them up, palms scarred with a lifetime of proving, and as sure as a woman can be who watched the master's gaze sit where it didn't belong. Estella opened her eyes, and the room returned, dim and precise. For a moment hatred rose, not for Eliza, not even for Donovan, but for the architecture of a world that required a woman like Eliza to become its memory, and then punished her for remembering. My son. The two syllables faltered. He asked me last night if sin can travel through blood like a fever. I told him we are not doctors of the soul. I lied to my own child because Her throat refused the rest. She looked at Eliza as if the older woman might loan her the strength to finish. Because I was afraid that the truth would Destroy him, Eliza supplied, gentle as a bandage. Maybe it will. Maybe keeping it will too. They stood in the seam of that maybe and felt how it cut. What will you do? Eliza asked, and it was not impertinence. It was a passing of the key. Estella walked to the escritoire and opened a drawer she had kept locked since Donovan's funeral. Inside lay a revolver wrapped in linen, a silver locket, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She removed none of it. She merely looked, as if by witnessing the artifacts she might narrow the universe of possible futures. First, she said, I will breathe. Then I will speak to God and receive no answer. Then I will speak to my son and give him one. Eliza nodded once. She had not planned to cry today, so she did not. I'll stay close. At the door, Estella paused. Eliza, she said without turning, you will tell no one else. You have my promise, Eliza replied, for as long as the truth remains yours to tell. Craig waited in the study, a room that remembered better days. He had arranged his notes across the desk in a fan of futility. Letters unanswered, drawings that made the impossible look simple, verses stabbed with ink. He rose when Estella entered, the way he had since he was small and fearful of being found wanting. The habit remained even as the roles had shifted. The mother diminished, the son enlarged by grief into something that barely fit his skin. You have spoken with Eliza, he said. I have. And? Estella did not sit. She wanted him to hear this on his feet. So you asked for a reason. She placed her fingertips on the desk and felt the gouge Donovan's ring had made years ago, an old rage fossilized into furniture. I have one to give. She watched the sentence travel through him, watched the muscle in his jaw jump, watched the pupils widen as if his eyes were bracing for a glare. She thought of the day he was born, how he had entered furious as if insulted by oxygen, and how relieved she had been to love something that did not frighten her. Eliza delivered a child in this house in 1827, Estella began, voice even. A girl who belonged to your father more than she should have. He sold her at 8, to hide what his face refused to. Years later, he brought her back through the market, unacknowledged, unnamed, except as property. You know her as Lena. Craig blinked once. The first thing that moved was not his hand or mouth, but the thought behind his eyes, quick and terrible, like lightning finding the tallest tree. He swayed as if struck. Then he reached for the desk and missed. Estella stepped forward without meaning to, and then stopped herself for reasons she could not bear to examine. No, he said, too softly for the word to be defense. No. I would spare you this, Estella said, and wished for a world in which sparing had been possible 10, 12, 19 years ago. But I cannot spare you and keep faith with the living at the same time. He laughed. It was the sound of something breaking that had been cracked for a long while. Faith, he repeated, and looked toward the ceiling as if the plaster might offer commentary. Is there a ledger for that too? His knees went loose. Estella stepped then fast, and caught his elbow with hands that had held him steady when his ankles were still unwieldy. He pulled away, not from her touch, but from her history. How could you— He stopped, swallowed, began again. How could he? Estella did not answer. There are questions that do not deserve the dignity of words. Craig moved around the desk, as if circling a grave he had dug without knowing. He stopped at the bookshelf and pressed his forehead against a row of volumes until the spines left a brief pattern on his skin. Micah, he said, and the name transformed the room. My— Language failed him there, and he let it. Estella watched him move through the stages of a storm, wind, rain, lightning, the sudden stillness afterward that frightens more than thunder. When he looked at her again, his face was that of a man who has seen the tide take the foundation and is calculating how long the facade can stand alone. Lena does not know, he said. Not a question. She does not, Estella answered. That ignorance was her only mercy. Craig nodded, a quick injured movement. Then it falls to me, he said, voice gone hoarse. To tell her. No. Estella's refusal arrived with more force than she intended. Not yet. There is a difference between truth and cruelty, and timing is the knife that separates them. She carries a second child, Craig said, so flatly the sentence hardly had weight. If what you have told me is true, ignorance is not mercy. It is a fuse. Estella closed her eyes. Eliza's metaphor returned, changed its dress, and demanded to be counted. When Estella opened her eyes again, she had already lost the argument with herself. You will not go to her in this state, she said. gathering the tattered remnants of authority. You will bathe. You will walk until your mind remembers your body. You will eat something bland. You will let me think. Craig stared at her, and for a heartbeat she saw the boy who used to fetch her fallen pins and place them in her palm like treasure. Then the man returned, and with him a species of resolve that looked too much like his father's for comfort. If I do as you say, he murmured, it will not be because you command it. It will be because I cannot yet form a sentence that will not cut her in half. He left before she could reply, and the study kept the echo of his boots the way a lectern keeps the last note of a hymn. Eliza waited in the hall, eyes searching Estella's face for what had been done. Estella gave the smallest nod, the kind soldiers exchange across smoke when a plan has already cost them something they can never name. Now we keep watch, Estella said, for the weather or the fire? Eliza asked. For both, Estella answered, and turned toward the chapel of her room where she would kneel without expecting rescue. Downstairs, the house tried to resume its breathing. In the quarters, pots were scrubbed, bread set to rise, brass polished until it reflected strangers. In the yard, a wind shifted, and the live oaks whispered to one another like elders who have seen this all before. The door had opened. The key had turned. What waited on the other side was not patience. For 2 days, the plantation pretended at normal. It was the sort of lie a house tells itself to keep the roof from sinking. Meals served at the old hours, bells rung with the old insistence, ledgers opened to the old columns that never once made room for ruin. But beneath the arithmetic of chores, something paced. Craig obeyed his mother the way a man obeys a doctor's orders he doesn't respect. He bathed until the heat left his skin raw. He walked the boundary ditches, counting fence posts as if numbers could hold him together. He ate half a biscuit and stared at the other half as if it might answer a question. Then he returned to the study and copied scripture until the letters themselves went strange. The page became a geometry of guilt. In the afternoons, he found himself at the little grave despite his resolution not to. He told Micah stories a father tells a son, about a heron he'd watched knife the water and come up clean, about a book whose spine had broken in his hands, about the shape of a word, mercy, that would not stay still. He did not say the other name. His mouth could not hold sister and beloved at the same time without bleeding. Estella, having decided nothing could be hurried except disaster, set about buying time. She sent a letter to a widowed cousin in Charleston, coarse paper, steady hand, inquiring after rooms, the sea air, the health of old acquaintances. It was not a request yet, only a net cast into possibility. She reviewed the household accounts and moved sums discreetly, the way a woman rearranges furniture, to see if a room will breathe differently. She spoke to the overseer about a brief trip she might take, and the behaviors she would not tolerate in her absence. She did all this with the unblinking calm of a surgeon. Only in the mirror did her eyes betray the tremor underneath. Eliza lingered near thresholds. She could not guard against what she could not name aloud, but she could be present at the places where trouble usually paused to draw breath. She kept tea warm and advice warmer, speaking in sentences that sounded like weather reports and meant more. With Lena she moved slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal that had every right to bolt. She stitched the girl back into the world with soup, a shawl repaired just so, a touch to the forehead that told a body it still belonged to itself. Lena folded silence over herself, like a quilt. She had not asked to be told anything, and yet every face seemed to be practicing its expression on her, too gentle, too careful, as if she were a glass with a crack only certain eyes could see. She took to the laundry in the afternoons, not for work but for the steam. The fog made the world kind. She would sit on a low stool and let the damp erase edges. When she surfaced, she felt both lighter and lost. On the third morning, Craig's resolve became a shape. He rose before light, dressed without ceremony, and went to the little chapel tucked off the main hall, the room Donovan had used as a place to polish his piety, where Estella had learned to count forgiveness like beads. It was a narrow room with a single window that offered the oaks in slices. Craig knelt and waited for an answer from a God who had been loudly silent all his life. "Tell me what to do," he said to the floorboards. "Tell me how to do it without destroying her." The room offered creaks and the scent of beeswax. A fly worried the sill. In the absence of an answer, Craig mistook urgency for instruction. He rose, steadied himself with a hand on the pew, and made for the back stairs. He did not reach Lena's door. Eliza met him in the corridor without meaning to, carrying clean towels, moving in her habitual orbit. She saw the set of his jaw and the way his breath caught at the top of his chest. A man bracing to break something delicate. Not like this, she said, low and firm, stepping into the path without making a show of it. He stared at her as if she had grown there from the wainscoting. I cannot wait, he said. Every minute I do, the wrong multiplies itself. Eliza tipped her head, considering. Then you reckon telling her now will divide it, or spread it like yeast? His mouth worked, the argument ready and useless. He leaned close, voice thinning. She is... The word snagged. She is owed the truth. Eliza softened just enough to be heard. Then pay your debt in a coin she can carry. Not the kind that crushes. Behind them, a floorboard announced another listener. Estella, she did not scold. She did not plead. She addressed the one faculty in Craig that still answered to her, his pride. You will not burst into a woman's room with a theorem, she said. You will speak to her where a chair can hold her and a door can stay open. And if you insist on setting your confession like a bone, you will give me the hour to make ready what must follow. It was the bargain of a battlefield. Craig, who had already lost too many skirmishes with himself, saluted it with a bitter nod. 1 hour, he said, and turned back toward the chapel as if faith could be manufactured on deadline. Estella and Eliza exhaled in the same breath. What will follow? Eliza asked when he was gone. Distance, Estella said, already moving. If he insists on tearing the cloth, I will at least hem the edges. Pack a trunk, 2 dresses, a shawl. Things that do not whisper where they came from. For the cousin. For the cousin, Estella lied, because even contingency plans listen when you name them. The hour did not pass clean. Trouble rarely respects the clock. In the laundry, Lena rose too fast from the stool and the room went bright around the edges. She braced a hand on the table and waited for the world to decide whether to keep her. When it returned, it did so with a new quiet certainty, a heaviness low and undeniable. She pressed her palm below her navel as if to hush it. Her mouth remembered a tune and rejected it. She found Eliza in her room sorting the trunk that was not yet a departure. I am late, Lena said without preamble, and the words were both confession and curse. Eliza's hands paused over the folded shawl. She had expected this truth like a change in season. It still stung like weather on a bad joint. Sit, she said, and pulled the chair out with a steadiness she did not feel. Lena sat. Does he know? Eliza asked. Lena shook her head, eyes on a knot in the floor. He's gone strange, she added after a beat, as if giving this information might lower a fever. Sometimes he looks at me like I am a window with something behind it he cannot bear to see. Eliza knelt to bring her face level. Listen to me, she said, and waited until Lena's eyes obeyed. Whatever storm is coming, your body ain't the enemy. You hear, you protect it first. You breathe. You drink. You let me stand in as many doors as I can. Lena nodded too fast, like agreement were a way to stay alive. Her hands twisted in her lap until the knuckles shone. They both started at the soft knock that followed. Estella stood in the doorway with a composure that had cost her blood to assemble. Lena, she said, using the name as if it were a fragile cup she did not want to chip. Walk with me. They chose the back veranda where the air moved and walls did not listen. The yard went about its business in low tones, chickens possessing the ground with their math, a boy dragging a rake like a smaller shadow. Estella rested her hands on the rail and regarded a sky that had not yet decided itself. What I'm about to say, Estella began, is difficult. I would not say it if silence could save you. Lena's throat worked. I'm listening. Estella did not tell the whole truth. Not yet. She reduced it to a shape Lena might hold without dropping it. There are things about your life before you came here that were not of your choosing, she said. They placed you in a path that, without your fault, crosses ours in ways that make future choices dangerous. Lena looked at her, trying to sew those sentences into sense. Do you mean... She hesitated, seeking a polite word for an impolite fact. Do you mean I should not be here? I mean, Estella said carefully, there is a door that may open to you soon, a city, a friend of mine, air that does not smell of this house. If it opens, I will ask you to walk through it. Not because you are unwelcome, but because welcome is not the same as safe. Lena's hand went again to her belly, a reflex that had outrun caution. Estella saw the gesture and felt the calendar narrow like a hallway. "We will talk more," she said, retreating from the brink she had promised herself not to cross today. "For now, know this. Your pain is not a punishment. Do not make bargains with shame. It never pays what it owes." Lena nodded, bewildered gratitude and fear colliding in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am," they parted. Estella climbed the steps with the stiffness of someone who has carried furniture alone. In the corridor she encountered Craig, washed and buttoned, the hour spent. The ruin dressed for company. On the veranda, she said, because if she could not stop him, she could at least choose the room he went. Lena heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were slower than usual, as if he had measured the distance and apportioned his breath. When he stepped into the light, she noticed a wildness had been pressed flat, the way hair is tamed with too much water. "May I sit?" he asked, which was not the question he had come to ask, but was the only one the moment could bear. She nodded. He sat, leaving a decent space between them that mocked the space between two lives. They watched a dragonfly draw a figure 8 in the warm air. "I have something to tell you," he began, and the dragonfly seemed to hang, listening. "I do not know how to do it without breaking you." Lena's fingers tightened on the rail until the wood printed a pattern in her skin. "Then perhaps do not," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of it. "We break enough here without help." He closed his eyes, took a breath, and opened them on the narrower mercy. "There are truths about your past that will make the future here unlivable," he said. "It is not your fault. It is the fault of men who arranged the world to suit their appetites and left us to swallow the splinters." She had never heard him speak so plain. It both steadied and frightened her. "What do you want me to do?" He looked at her, really looked, as if memorizing what unbroken still looked like. "Live," he said, and the word carried everything he could not yet confess. "Far from here if we can manage it. Soon." The veranda held the sentence between them like a basin of water sloshing near the lip. Lena swallowed. She stopped, weighed something, and let it go. "I will do as you say." The obedience did not sound servile. It sounded like a woman choosing the only door that did not lead straight into fire. Craig's face wavered, relief and desolation in equal parts. He stood too quickly, as if the bench had grown hot. "I will make arrangements," he said, and left before gratitude could become a different kind of confession. From the far corner of the yard, Eliza watched him go and knew a small victory when she saw one. The fuse had met water for today. Tomorrow would bring its own flint. Inside, Estella sealed the letter to Charleston with wax, pressed her signet into it, and held it a heartbeat longer than necessary. The gesture felt both theatrical and inadequate, like praying with your hands and sinning with your mouth. Overhead, clouds gathered from 3 directions at once, and the oaks began their low, habitual gossip. Somewhere in the house, a door eased itself open on tired hinges. No one noticed which. The reply from Charleston arrived 3 days later, the seal cracked by Estella's thumb in the privacy of her room. The cousin, Margaret Finley, widow discreet, accustomed to hosting problems in the shape of young women, wrote that the city's air was good for lungs and reputations. A room could be ready in a week. No one need ask whose footsteps filled the stair at night. She would send a carriage halfway to meet them at Colleton, and if anyone asked, Lena would be a hired girl, traveling ahead to prepare a household. Estella read the letter twice, and felt both grateful and insulted by how easily the world had been trained to make room for certain lies, arrangements multiplied like ants, a trunk chosen for sturdiness rather than pedigree. 2 dresses let out at the seams, not because Estella dared name the reason, but because she knew a garment that pinched could betray its wearer. Papers were drafted, the kind that said a person belonged to a household even as they traveled away from it. The overseer was told as little as possible and exactly enough. There would be absence, there would be no gap in the fields, and he would be watched. Craig tried to be useful the way a penitent tries to be holy, with a frenzy that made steadiness impossible. He rode to the lower parish to speak to a carter who asked no questions. He visited the bank in town and returned with coins that would buy silence if it had a price that day. He rehearsed sentences he would say to no one. "You will be safe. This is my fault. Forgive me if you can. Forget me if you must." Eliza handled the tasks no one else remembered mattered. A small packet of dried ginger for the sickness that came in waves. A length of clean linen wrapped tight against the day when it would be needed. An address in Charleston written in a hand Lena could recognize even if fear blurred her vision. A pin tucked into the hem for courage. "When you feel it prick, that's me," she said. "That's me saying keep your head." Word leaked anyway because houses gossip by the way they open and close their doors. In the yard, two women at the pump paused their rhythm long enough to exchange a look. At the smokehouse, the boy with the rake kept raking in one spot as if the earth there were especially guilty. The overseer's mouth made a thin line. He had the talent of a man who could turn questions into threats by changing nothing but the angle of his chin. "Trip to Charleston?" he said to Craig too lightly. "Late in the season for heir. Heir is when we can get it," Craig replied, and saw the man file the answer against a future day. Lena moved like someone learning a new instrument, careful, listening to how each motion might sound to someone else. She packed and unpacked the trunk at Eliza's insistence until her hands knew where everything lived by heart. In the laundry steam, she whispered the city's name like a charm, Charleston, a place she remembered only by fragments, market cries, the river's trapeze glitter, a doorway where she had once watched the night arrive in a different color. The night before the departure, Estella called Craig to the study and closed the door with a firmness that said, "We will be finished when I say so." "You will not go with her," she began. Bypassing pleasantry and pity alike, he was ready to argue. He had dressed to make his will look respectable. She will need not to be tied to the man whose name has already cost her too much," Estella said, denying him even the facet of himself that thought of kindness as a kind of claim. "Every mile you ride beside her narrows her road. My cousin's coachman will meet Eliza and the girl in Colleton. You will remain here and make this place look exactly as it did the day before the earth shifted." He stared at her. And beneath the stare something more dangerous flexed, an inheritance neither of them wanted to claim. "You send her away and keep me? I send her toward a life that might not kill her," Estella said, each word a plank laid across a ravine. "You will stand here and hold the bridge until she is across." He laughed once, raw and brief. "And after she is across?" Estella did not answer. Not because she did not know, but because the answer was a cliff and they had run out of boards. He turned to go, then halted in the doorway. The question he had promised himself he would not ask breaking surface anyway. "When she is safe, may I—" He caught the prayer and changed its clothes. "May I write?" "No," Estella said, soft and absolute. "Leave her the mercy of distance. Let your love be the kind that does not ask to be recognized in the street." He nodded as if struck, then bowed slightly, the old-fashioned, useless courtesy of a boy who had once known which rule to follow. "Yes, Mother." Before dawn, the house woke itself with unusual gentleness. No doors banged. No pots declared their purpose. Lena ate a heel of bread she did not taste. Eliza tied the trunk straps and tucked the ginger packet a finger deeper. Estella came to the veranda in a shawl that had comforted her in other winters, and did not this one. They had chosen the smaller wagon, the one that looked like a trip to market rather than a passage. Eliza took the reins. Lena climbed up, then back down, then up again, as if practicing the motion might keep the consequences from finding her. Craig did not appear. Estella had asked him not to. He did not trust himself to obey, unless he made obedience sound like obedience to God. At the last moment, Lena turned and looked at the house. She did not hate it. The opposite of love is not hate. It is the slack space where a thing no longer has your story in it. "Thank you," she said to Estella, and the words cost both women more than money. "Go," Estella said, and meant, "Live enough that you can afford to remember me well, or not at all." Eliza clucked to the horse. The wagon rolled. The Oaks watched and did not speak. On the lane that led away from the big house, the morning gathered itself into fog, as if willing to hide them from eyes that made everything a tally. Lena held herself still and counted breaths, not because Eliza had told her to, but because the air seemed to ask for inventory. "Hold on to your name," Eliza said without looking over. "Even if you can't say it out loud for a while." "What is my name?" Lena asked, a child's question asked by someone who had not been a child in a very long time. "The one you've been holding," Eliza said. "The one you make every time you choose soft over mean." "That name." They rode in silence long enough to outrun the first clutch of fields. Birds came to the fence and reconsidered. The road widened, then narrowed again around, a bend that had remembered wagon wheels for as long as wagons had been. Passing, they were halfway. to the river crossing when the first obstacle appeared. Ryder stepped out from a stand of pines, not fast, not slow, as if he had always meant to be there at this hour. Sheriff William Hartwell tipped his hat at Eliza, and then at Lena, the brim catching the weak sun and throwing it back like a coin. "Morning," he said, as if he were commenting on weather and had no opinion about law. "Early trip." Eliza kept the lines loose, the horse's mouth soft in her hands. "Mistress's cousin in Charleston took a turn," she replied. "We're going to fetch her help." Hartwell smiled with 3/4 of his mouth. He had learned long ago how to balance menace and charm so skillfully that most people never saw the scale. "Always a charity in this house," he said, and let the implications saunter out ahead of him. His gaze slid to Lena, then away, then back like a man rehearsing the act of not noticing. "Papers?" he asked casually, and Eliza produced them without making a show of rustling. He glanced, folded, handed them back. "Looks proper," he said. "Most things do." The silence afterward wore boots. "You give my regards to Miss Estella," he added, turning his horse half a degree as if it had been his own idea to move along. "Tell her the county sleeps easier when her lamps are lit." Eliza nodded. "We'll do that." He touched his hat brim again and rode on with the unhurried confidence of a man who relied less on speed than on the knowledge that every road here eventually led to his porch. They did not breathe until the pines swallowed him. "Keep your eyes on the road," Eliza said softly. "Ain't no use staring after trouble. It knows its way back without help." They reached the ferry an hour later. The man there accepted coins and offered gossip as change. The river ran brown and indifferent beneath them, a living thing that had learned the uses of silence better than people had. On the far bank, the road to Colleton unspooled, a thin, practical line toward a city that would swallow their footprints without comment. Back at the plantation, Craig watched from behind the slats of an upstairs shutter as the wagon became a dot and then a notion and then nothing. His body kept the posture of standing long after his legs wanted to bend. When he finally sat, it was on the edge of his bed, hands loose, like a man who has just discovered that the house he lives in does not exist from certain angles. Estella stood in the study and wrote to Margaret Finley again, a small note this time, folded around the first and tucked into the blue ribbon. "They have left. Receive them with the kind of kindness that does not ask questions. Burn this when it has finished its work." By afternoon, the house had returned to its regular noises, but every sound wore a new edge. A laugh in the kitchen cut too sharply. A door upstairs closed with unnecessary finality. The clock in the hall insisted on each minute, as if fearful the others would not arrive. Toward evening, a rider came with Hartwell's card, engraved with nothing but his name. On the back, a note in an elegant hand. "Stopped a wagon this morning. All in order. My regards." Estella placed the card in the fire and watched the sheriff's name turn from script to cinder. Some courtesies are small declarations of war. Night fell clear. The oaks stood like black sails against a sky that finally remembered how to be wide. In her small room at Margaret Finley's boarding house, Lena would later try to sleep and count a new kind of silence. On the road back from Colleton, Eliza would sit beside the carter under a slice of moon and hum her courage into her own bones so it wouldn't leak out before morning. And in the Lambert study, Craig opened his Bible to a page he had underlined to bleeding and read until the words stopped meaning and became only shapes. He had obeyed. It did not feel like virtue. It felt like a man holding the end of a rope after the person on the other end had let go. Charleston received them the way harbors receive storms, without remark, with room. The streets shone from a night rain, brick sweating, carriage wheels hissing along East Bay like serpents too tired to posture. Margaret Finley's house stood on a narrow lane where Jasmine tried to soften history and shutters had learned to close themselves. She took one look at Lena, really looked, the way women do when the world has already decided too much, and opened her door wider. "You will call me Mrs. Finley in the hall and Margaret in the kitchen," she said, brisk as a bandage. "You will answer no questions for 3 days. After that, only those you choose. The bed is small but clean. The rules are unfair but mine." Eliza handed over the letter and the trunk and her worry in the shape of a list. Margaret accepted each with the economy of a woman who had made a profession of catching falling things. "You'll eat," she said to Lena, not asking. "Then sleep. Then eat again." The room at the back took the afternoon like a balm. whitewashed, a window that stared at a fig tree, a quilt that had already survived other women's midnights. Lena sat on the bed and let her bones admit their fatigue. Distant, the harbor lifted and sighed. When Margaret brought broth, Lena's hands shook as she took the bowl. When she tried the first spoonful, hunger surprised both of them. "You are safe here," Margaret said, and felt the lie of absolute safety pinch her tongue. She amended it with honesty. "You are safer here." Eliza stayed the night on a pallet near the hearth because departure should be a taper, not a snuffing. In the morning she put a parcel in Lena's hands, a folded handkerchief with the sprig of dried mint stitched clumsy but true into one corner. "For when something needs remembering sweet," Eliza said. "I'll be back by the spring if I can contrive it. If I can't, you still will." They stood in the narrow doorway and practiced the kind of goodbye that doesn't admit it is one. Eliza's thumb traced Lena's cheekbone just once. Then she was gone, the sound of her steps swallowed by the city's appetite. Back on the plantation, Eliza arrived at dusk with grit in the hem of her skirt and a quiet that made Estella straighten before she spoke. "Safe?" Estella asked. "As a woman can be who ain't been asked her own name for most of her life," Eliza said, easing herself onto a chair. "Your cousin's house runs like a clock made by a kind person. She'll keep our girl between the teeth of the town and the tongue of it." Estella closed her eyes and allowed herself one precisely measured breath of relief. Then the house coughed up the sheriff. William Hartwell did not come pounding because pounding announces ignorance, and he liked to arrive with omniscience. His knock was confident as a fact. Estella met him in the hall framed by portraits that had watched men lie to her for 30 years. "Mrs. Lambert," he said, hat held in fingers too delicate for the work his face did. "You received my card." "And burned it," Estella said pleasantly. A corner of his mouth nodded. "Prudent." His glance wandered. "A gentleman's trespass. I encountered a wagon on the Colleton Road. Routine interest, nothing more." "Your papers were in order." He let the compliment slither toward her. "It is a comfort to know this county's first families keep their affairs well stapled." "Affairs," Estella said without flinching, "require fewer staples when they are not rifled by county men." Hartwell held her gaze and smiled a little wider, as if pleased to be parried well. "I do admire a house that keeps its candles trimmed," he said. "Have a good evening, Mrs. Lambert." He tipped his hat toward the stairs where he knew the son he had not seen was listening. "My regards to the young master." When he was gone, Estella leaned against the wall and pressed her palm over the place where fear nested like a second heart. "We are not alone," she said to the empty air. "Very well." Craig emerged from the landing with the brittle composure of a man who has just discovered he lives in glass. "He knows," he said. "He suspects," Estella corrected. "Men like Hartwell are content with the suspicion if it keeps the leash tight." "I should have gone," Craig blurted, the confession shaped like an argument. "I should have—" "You should remain," Estella cut in. "We've removed the match. Do not set yourself on fire in its place." He stared at her a moment longer, and then did what he always did with orders he could not refuse, turned them into vows. "I will not write," he said, as if saying it made it virtue. "Good," Estella said, though the word tasted like ash. In Charleston, Lena learned the city's mercies and meannesses on the same street. Margaret's house kept a demure ledger, guests' deliveries, repairs, while holding another ledger beneath it in the mind. Who comes broken, who leaves bent but moving, who must be sent away before a knock at midnight turns into a search. "Walk with your eyes," Margaret counseled on their first errand. "Not your chin. If you must look back, do it with your lashes." They went to market for fruit and a dozen small exchanges that made belonging plausible. A fishmonger called Margaret Widow Finley, with an affection that meant debt settled years ago. A seamstress lifted a brow and measured Lena with a glance. By afternoon, a bodice had been let out without comment. A midwife, Mrs. Priest, hands clean, voice kinder than rumor, offered tea in silence. "I keep a room where no one asks who the father is," Mrs. Priest said evenly, "or whether there will be one. Some women need help early. Some need help late. Some need only to be told they are not cursed." The word landed in Lena's chest like a stone meeting water. "Am I?" she asked, too fast. Mrs. Priest didn't pretend she hadn't heard. "I am a practical woman, miss." She let the name trail off so it would not be necessary to manufacture one. "Curses are for men who need explanations for their appetites. Bodies do what bodies do. Sometimes sorrow follows. We meet both." Margaret watched Lena drink the tea as if it were permission. When they left, she pressed a card into Lena's palm. "For when I can't answer the door," she said. "Or when you cannot ask." Nights were harder. Without the grand, unfriendly shape of the plantation house to lean against, memory had more sky. Lena lay listening to the city's dialect of noise, sailor songs blurred by tavern doors, wheels over stone, the sea speaking in its sleep, and counted the spaces between her breaths. Sometimes she dreamed of the empty crib. Sometimes of a child with a brow smooth as a new coin, reaching for her with hands that knew nothing of how the world bargains. On the fourth morning, nausea struck with a decisiveness that left no room for denial. It came like a tide and left like one too, but the taste it put in her mouth did not wash away. Margaret handed her a slice of lemon and a look. "You may stay," Margaret said, "but staying is not the only verb available." Lena met the older woman's eyes and found there a kindness that did not condescend and a steel that did not apologize. "I will stay," she said, and meant more than the city. "Then we will make a list," Margaret said. "Lists are a kind of prayer that the secular can manage. On the list, Mrs. Priest twice a month. A job mending linens in a house that would not ask where she had learned such neat stitches. A story that placed her origins somewhere nobody wanted to visit. A new habit of walking in the morning when men were still telling each other lies about the night. Some evenings, after the boarders had eaten and left their compliments like crumbs, Margaret would find Lena on the back step, with the fig leaves holding shadows. "You do not have to be brave all the time," Margaret would say, sitting without announcing her intention to sit. "You can be only present." "It is enough." Lena tried the sentence on in her mouth and found it fit. On the plantation, the absence grew its own edges. The nursery became a room again no one entered. The grave received Craig at dawn and then resented him by afternoon. He wrote letters he did not send to men with medical Latin in their signatures. He read verses that had never been meant to bear this much weight and pressed them into service anyway. Hartwell passed by once a week without fail, never asking the question he wanted to ask, leaving with the satisfaction of a fisherman whose net was invisible from shore. "Your son grows pale," he mentioned to Estella one Thursday. Like a physician remarking on weather. "Grief fashions its own colors," Estella returned. "Indeed," Hartwell said, his gaze taking the measure of the stairs again, the way sound carried there. The county would be poorer for losing such a diligent bookkeeper. Estella filed the nicety under threats that wear cologne and kept her mouth. When he left, she poured herself 2 fingers of a cordial she did not like and drank it as if it were medicine. Eliza found her there and set down a plate, not because anyone had asked for food, but because a body cannot run on memory alone. "Boys unravel in thread by thread," Eliza said quietly. "Find me a seam that will hold," Estella replied, just as quiet. Eliza thought of the city and the woman there with her rules. "The seam is away," she said. "We've done right. Doing right ain't the same as feeling saved." Estella pressed her thumb so hard into the cordial glass's rim that it squealed. "I know." That night a storm came up fast off the river, one of those sudden theatricals that make old houses announce their age. Rain hit the windows with coins. In his room, Craig lit a lamp and then another as if light could counterfeit sleep. He took out a sheet of paper and began a letter he had promised not to write. "Lena," he wrote and stopped. He tried another beginning. "Miss," he could not cheapen her with a false name, "forgive me." He had no right to ask. He folded the paper in half and then in half again until it could not bear another crease. At the window, lightning drew the yard briefly in chalk. For a split second he saw them, the oaks, the path to the quarters, the roofline. Then darkness reclaimed its land. Something yielded inside him with a sound he alone heard. He went to the chapel and knelt without words, not to beg but to be still in a room where Wood remembered other people's prayers. When he returned to his bed, he did not undress. Morning found him kneeling still. In Charleston, weeks began to accumulate in a way Lena had not imagined weeks could, gently. Mrs. Priest's hands were sure. Margaret's rules softened where they should and hardened where they must. At market, a woman selling figs slipped Lena an extra piece wrapped in paper without explanation. On Sunday mornings, the clamour from St. Philip's bells braided with the calls of men selling oysters from barrels, and for once the world did not insist on choosing holiness or hunger. But the past keeps its own calendar. One afternoon, Margaret returned from an errand with her lips thinner than usual. She closed the parlor door and spoke into the wool of the rug, as if it could absorb what the walls should not hear. "A gentleman called at Mrs. Priest's," she said. "Left no name. Too much cologne. Asked whether a young woman of your description had come in for advice. Mrs. Priest has a talent for answering questions with moral outrage. He left with none of what he sought and all of what he deserved. But I do not like men who wear questions like gloves." Lena's stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with mourning. "Hartwell," she whispered, learning how to hate quietly. "Perhaps," Margaret said, "or someone who thinks himself Hartwell's friend." She took Lena's hand and placed in it a key, a small brass thing with no romance to it. "For the back gate," she said. "If ever a visitor requires you to become a shadow." That night, Margaret walked the perimeter of her own house palm along brick, counting hinges as if they were rosary beads. In the back room, Lena slept and dreamed of a door that opened onto a field so wide the sky lost its balance. December edged the fields at Lambert in a grey that ironed even the live oaks. Estella's cough started like an argument she refused to have and stayed to make its point. Eliza brewed thyme and honey and slapped the cup gently into Estella's hand. "Don't you dare," she said, not unkindly. "I have not the leisure to die," Estella agreed and drank. On a Tuesday, Hartwell returned on foot. No horse's prop, no hat flourish. He accepted tea, which he did not drink, and placed his cup on the saucer with care. "A small matter," he said. "A woman of your house visited the city. Women talk. When they talk too much, men sometimes listen. I would be remiss if I did not inquire whether any family business has been exported without the proper labels." Estella held him with a gaze so cool the china ought to have frosted. "Sheriff," she said, "I have always labeled what needed labeling, linen, wine, coffins. My house requires no help from your pen." "Of course," he said, rising. His smile did not reach his eyes, as if they had farther to travel than any expression could carry. "My regards to your son again." When he'd gone, Estella stood very still, as if movement might invite collapse. Eliza, who had not sat for the entire exchange, exhaled a breath she'd been saving for a worse hour, and found it did not ease anything. "He smells blood," Eliza said. "Then he will learn this house still has teeth," Estella replied, and reached for the pistol she kept wrapped in linen in the drawer, not because she intended to fire it, but because the metal weight steadied her hand. That night, the house dreamed of fire. It was only wind and a plate left too close to a candle that had burned itself out hours earlier, but smoke threaded the hall in a practice run. Eliza woke first, heart leaping into her throat. She walked the corridors with a lamp, nudging doors open, sniffing, touching the cool brass of knobs. At Craig's room she hesitated, then went in. He sat at the desk with a blank page, eyes open but nowhere present. "Child," she said, and the word carried no sarcasm. "You got to sleep or you'll go poor." He looked up at her and something in his face had settled. Not peace, but the stillness that sometimes comes before a good decision or a bad one. "I sent no letters," he said, as if that were a virtue he wanted graded. "I have done everything right." Eliza set the lamp down and went to him. She put her palm against his cheek, the way she had when he was feverish at 12, and had believed that death was the price for too much fishing in cold water. "Right ain't the same thing as healed," she said. "Sometimes it's just quiet." He closed his eyes into her hand. For a second he was only warmth and breath. Then he stood, reseated the chair under the desk exactly square, and exhaled. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. When she had gone, he blew out the lamp, and for the first time in months lay down as if a bed were not a confession. Outside, the oaks kept vigil. Far away, a ship's bell marked the hour, and the sea repeated it. A teacher correcting a student gently. Charleston slept. The plantation dozed with one eye open. In both places, a small, fragile thing persisted. The ordinary. Bread rose. Coals glowed. Somewhere a child laughed at a nothing remarkable joke. Somewhere a woman squared a stack of linens and felt briefly the satisfaction of edges matching. The fuse coiled itself a little more loosely. The fire for now found other wood. January lifted itself over Charleston in a pale, mannerly light, the sort that flatters facades and spares no one's insides. Lena learned the city's winter by its breath, salt a little sharper, wind a little nosier at keyholes. She learned also how to count days without counting down. Mrs. Priest kept the calendar for her, marking visits with a discreet dot and never writing a name. The midwife's room smelled of soap instead of incense, of boiled linen instead of fear. She spoke as if the body were a citizen with rights. "You may carry," she said, "or you may not. Either way, you are not wicked for wanting to live." The wanting gathered in Lena like a tide. Nights she dreamed two futures that never touched. In one, a child with a smooth brow reached for her. In the other, she stood at a station holding nothing but a ticket and the kind of hunger that points forward. Morning made both possibilities heavy. Margaret did not advise. She arranged. A coin in a seam here, a carriage at the corner there, a room that could be borrowed for an afternoon without neighbors inventing a narrative. "You will not apologize in my house," she told Lena, catching the reflex before the mouth could form it. "You will not explain. You will decide." Lena decided on a Tuesday the city had given to rain. She chose not to carry. She chose breath and breadth, and in Mrs. Priest's clean rooms she was met by competence rather than ceremony. No lecture, no prayer she did not ask for, no men. Margaret held her hand and studied the window so Lena would not feel watched. When it was done, Mrs. Priest pressed a cup of something warm into her palm and set a little bell within reach only to say, "You ring when you want me. Not because I think you will fail." Afterward the world returned in small squares. Quilt Square, Fig Leaf Square, the square of light that moved across the floor as the day remembered itself. Lena slept and woke to a body that felt like it belonged to her again, saw where it should be, emptied of a terror that had leased the room behind her ribs. Grief came too, not as a judge, but as a companion who knew how to be quiet. "Eat," Margaret said, "because sometimes love is a bowl on a lap and the insistence behind it." Lena spooned broth and did not cry. When tears arrived later, they came like weather, brief, thorough, not requiring an audience. News travels on the backs of men who do not know what they are carrying. In Charleston, a certain apothecary, as proud of his discretion as of his new French scales, mentioned over a different sort of counter a run on a particular herb. The listener had a friend at the courthouse. The friend played cards with a deputy who liked to impress by inference. Before the week was out, a paper with no letterhead lay on Sheriff Hartwell's desk, bearing no names and all the implication he required. He did not ride to the Lambert place at once. Patience was his tonic. He waited 2 days and then came with a face composed for sympathy. "Your cousin in Charleston is industrious," he told Estella in the front hall, as if praising a recipe. "I hear her rooms are quite useful." Estella's cough had settled into a dry punctuation she refused to obey. She did not invite him further in. "A woman's usefulness," she said, "is rarely measured by the men discussing it." "Touché," Hartwell murmured, savoring the syllables the way a man rolls a foreign candy on his tongue. "And the young woman you sent, does she thrive?" Estella's lashes lowered half a degree. "She lives," she said, because that was the only sentence that would neither betray nor beg. Hartwell tipped his hat and left behind, as ever, the scent of a man who wanted people to mistake polish for virtue. In the study, Craig stepped out from the shadow his mother's back had cast. He had heard enough of the exchange to shape its whole and fit himself inside. "She lives," he repeated, as if trying on the word. "And I do not." "You will," Estella said, and hated the thinness of her confidence. She had begun to measure each day by 2 gauges, how much breath remained and how much authority it could carry. That night, Craig's vow not to write metastasized into a different vow, not to remain. He prepared with the carefulness of a man planning a sin he would call a rescue. He folded 2 shirts, put coins and a small Bible into a satchel, and placed a letter on his desk addressed to no one, inked with apologies the house would be forced to read in his absence. In the morning, he told his mother he would visit the lower fields, a lie dressed like routine. He saddled a bay and pointed it toward the river road. Eliza watched him go with a knowing that had tired of being right. She found Estella in the morning room, pale not from fashion. "He's after her," Eliza said. Estella closed her eyes and for the first time in months allowed herself a sound that resembled a sob, but refused to be one. "Send Jonah," she said. Jonah, the quiet stable hand who could outride trouble without making dust of it. "If Craig reaches the ferry, Jonah will reach him. If he reaches Colleton, God help us." Eliza went to the yard and gave orders with the efficiency of a woman who had been commanded all her life and learned to command back. Jonah swung up bareback, hat low, and the bay leapt forward as if it too understood what restitution looked like at a gallop. Charleston had a way of making arrivals feel elective. Craig came in at dusk, every brick warm with the day's stored light. He asked for Margaret Finley's house by describing a lane and a fig tree, and the scent of jasmine that tried to make sin look domestic. The directions he received were an arrangement of gestures rather than words, as if everyone knew and no one wanted to be caught knowing. At the corner near Margaret's door, Jonah caught him, quiet hand on bridle. Voice pitched to the private key menus when they are about to say something that can ruin or rescue. "Master Craig," he said, "no tremor. You can go up those steps and undo every stitch the ladies sewed with their hands. Or you can turn with me, breathe, and let what's been spared be spared." Craig stared at the door. He had imagined a threshold that would sanctify his arrival, a little light falling just so. Instead, he found brick, wood, the creak of a hinge when the wind shifted, no music. "Only consequence. My child is buried in dirt," he said, and the sentence startled him with its steadiness. There was another. The word snagged and tore. There was not another. Jonah did not flinch. "Sometimes salvation is the path you don't walk." A curtain breathed in Margaret's front room. She had heard the hoofbeats, the near stop, the voices not calling names. She did what prudent women do when men bring storms. She blew out the nearest lamp and waited in the learned darkness, one hand on the stair banister, the other on the latch of the back gate. Craig closed his eyes and saw not Lena's face, but the look she would wear if he put her in danger merely by standing where she could see him. He saw Hartwell's card and the way his mother's finger had pressed the wax seal flat. He saw Micah's small grave and understood, with the cruel clarity grief sometimes grants, that remorse is not remedy. He put the reins in Jonah's palm like a confession. "Take me away from here," he said, and in saying it he managed for once a species of courage that looked nothing like conquest. They turned. Margaret watched two shadows leave the street and did not exhale until hoofbeats dissolved back into the city's general heartbeat. Then she climbed the stairs, counted to 12, and only then went to Lena's door. "It's nothing," she said, which was the lie women tell to mean everything has been delayed, not denied. "Go back to sleep." Lena, who had learned to read the grammar of floorboards, nodded and did not sleep at all. On the road out of the city, Jonah kept the pace functional rather than heroic. Heroics leave dust and dust leaves stories. When the river lay ahead, purpled by evening and moored to itself, he drew up and spoke in the same private key. "You did right," he said. Craig gave a dry laugh that didn't quite qualify as laughter. "It feels like nothing. Sometimes nothing is the hole a bullet didn't make." They crossed on the last ferry, the ferryman too tired to ask questions priced above his pay. Night came on with the practical indifference winter prefers. They rode without talk until the miles began to blur the way pain blurs into simple fatigue. Back at the plantation the next day, Craig walked into the study and placed his satchel on the desk he had abandoned. Estella sat already in his chair, as if occupying it might discourage ghosts. She looked at the bag and then at him and then carefully at nothing. "I thought you would," she said. "And then I thought you might not." "I stood at the door," he answered, truth a currency he could still afford. "I did not knock." Estella allowed herself one nod, the kind generals share far from their soldiers. "Sit," she said, and he did. And for a moment the house seemed to remember its original dimensions. From the hallway, Hartwell's absence felt like a presence. He would return because men like him always returned, to remind, to prod, to prove that a leash doesn't have to be visible to chafe. Eliza brought tea none of them wanted and made them drink it anyway. "We ain't finished," she said, saving nobody from honesty. "But we ain't burnt down neither." Craig lifted the cup and held it, heat seeping into his fingers like a small mercy. He stared past the rim at a point where the air looked ordinary and made himself believe that was a kind of progress. In Charleston, the days after the Tuesday settled like snow that knew better than to boast of its beauty. Lena mended linens at a table near the back window and learned to like the way sunlight could turn thread into wire. Sometimes she would press the stitched mint into her palm and think of Eliza's thumb on her cheekbone. Sometimes she would put her hand on the flat place over her belly and feel both ache and relief, the way a healed wound sometimes hums. On a market morning, she saw a man in a hat like Hartwell's and discovered that the city had given her a new reflex, to become smaller without vanishing. She turned, paid for figs, and listened to her own breath until it sounded like it belonged to the person making it. Brave is not loud, Margaret told her that evening. As if answering a question Lena hadn't asked aloud. Brave keeps showing up. Lena set another stitch and knotted it clean. At Lambert, February wrote its grey letters and left them unsealed. The fields waited for instructions no one had the heart to give. Estella's cough stayed, manageable but opinionated. Eliza watched the horizon with an expression that combines prayer and planning. Craig, having learned the shape of restraint, wore it like a shirt that still itched but did not blister. Then one morning a letter from Charleston arrived in a tidy hand that was not Margaret's. Mrs. Priest had written brief and professional. The young woman is well. No complications. She is readier each day to belong to herself. Kindly refrain from sending men to my door. It lowers the tone. Estella read it once and set it down as if it might spoil with too much handling. Craig read it over her shoulder and swallowed around the word well until it went down like medicine, finally finding the blood. Good, he said, and heard how small the syllable was compared to the distance it tried to cover. Eliza took the letter last and tapped it against her palm, the way a person tests a melon for ripeness. Now, she said mostly to the heir, we keep our heads low and our doors high. But the house had always had other ideas. It remembered fire. It remembered men who liked to arrive without being asked. It remembered that secrets change their weight when carried by the living too long, and it had, unfortunately, for all of them, an excellent memory for the month of March arrived with a rumor of warmth and the manners of a thief. It laid a soft hand on the oaks and then took something you weren't watching. The plantation woke to small, treacherous tendernesses, sun on railings, a breeze that pretended not to remember winter, and beneath them, the same pacing shadow. Hartwell came back with nothing new to say and a new way to say it. He presented himself at Estella's door in a suit the color of forgiveness. I hear, he began as if confiding a blessing, that your cousin's house is flourishing. His eyes traveled the hall the way ivy does, slow, invasive, inevitable. Charleston is such a generous city to the fallen, and to those who make sure they fall quietly. Estella's cough had settled into a dry scrape, a punctuation she refused to let period her sentences. Sheriff, she answered, silk over wire, our household flourishes because we keep our books clean. As for cities, generosity is a trait men like to ascribe to places when they cannot find it in themselves. Hartwell smiled with 3/4 of his mouth. I shall make a note of your philosophy. He tipped his hat toward the stairs again, where the acoustics pleased him. My regards to your son. A diligent man, if a trifle unwell. He left without drinking the tea he always refused. When the door shut, Estella placed both palms against the wood and breathed like a swimmer at the wall. In the kitchen, Eliza set down a bowl she'd been filling and did not watch it slosh. He's tightening the rope by staring at it, she said. Men like that get drunk on the look. Then we will stop standing in the window, Estella replied. She drew herself up with the will of a woman who has learned to counterfeit sturdiness with posture. I'll send a second note to Mrs. Finley. If the city grows too curious, a change of lodging is a tonic. Charleston agreed. Curiosity there is simply weather with better diction. Margaret received Estella's letter and folded it into her apron with 3 others that needed answering. She had already noticed the new faces lingering near the apothecary, the gentleman who found reasons to dawdle by Mrs. Priest's door and consult his pocket watch, the whisper that stiffened a conversation when Lena passed. News changes its clothes when it wants to enter a better house, Margaret told Lena, pinning a hem with brisk competence. We'll help it fail. They rehearsed routes no one would think pretty. The fishmonger's alley that smelled like the aftermath of miracles, the back gate that creaked, only if you wanted it to, the boarding house on Trad, where the keeper prided herself on identifying guests by their tea preference rather than their past. Mrs. Priest offered her arm and an address written small. If anyone asks, she said mildly, remind them I'm a midwife, not a librarian. I do not lend names. The move happened at dusk when kindness and discretion look alike in a sash. Lena carried the trunk that had learned her weight and the new habit of containing exactly what mattered. On the step, Margaret pressed her hands once. No one is owed your story, she said. You may give it as alms or keep it as coin. At the corner, Lena glanced back and saw the fig leaves darken into silhouettes. She did not cry. She counted her steps and at every third touched the small mint stitch Eliza had made. On the plantation, Craig turned restraint into routine. Dawn at Micah's grave, Noon with ledgers. Evening in the chapel where silence let him exist without explanation. He had not become peaceful, only practiced. Estella's cough nudged him like an insistent thought he refused to have. He began to take her arm on the stairs without naming the kindness, and she allowed it without praising it. Trouble, bored with Hartwell's pacing, decided to try another door. It began with smoke that thought itself a lesson. A maid left a taper guttering in the back corridor, a candle that had always behaved until it did not. A charline licked the wainscoting. A lace curtain flirted too close to an old flame. The house woke the way old houses do, groaning, then shouting. Eliza smelled it first. She ran with the strength stern years had not stolen, smothered the lace with a damp cloth, and beat the wall with a rug as if beating could undo negligence. Craig reached her with a bucket, then two. The fire reconsidered and obeyed. Smoke made a sermon of the hall. Estella arrived last, hand at her throat, eyes too bright. When the steam rose from the scorched paint, she laughed once, a clean, almost delighted sound, shocking as a swear from a nun. "See," she said to no one and to everyone. "I'm not mad. The house remembers fire, they aired the rooms." The kitchen reeked of boiled linen and relief. Later, when the char cooled into a lesson, Eliza put her palm to the wall and listened. "Next time," she said, "it won't be an accident that looks like one." Craig spent the night in the corridor on a chair, boots on, pistol set on the table where the Bible usually sat. He did not touch either. He watched, and discovered that vigilance is a kind of prayer the body knows how to perform when the mind runs out of words. Hartwell returned 2 mornings after the smoke with a folded paper and a face he had tuned to regret. "A complaint," he said, holding out the paper with fingertips as if he were above the grime. Anonymous, naturally. "It alleges improprieties. Transport of property without proper—" He let the sentence wander to the pasture it had always wanted. "Improprieties tend to breed." Estella did not take the paper. "Anonymous is the refuge of men who cannot spell their own names without help," she said. "You'll forgive me if I do not treat ghosts as plaintiffs." Hartwell almost laughed. "You are very good at this," he said. "It is almost charming." His gaze slid past her to the scorched section of wall where new paint had not yet declared itself. "Careful with your tapers, Mrs. Lambert. One spark—" He made a little gesture with his fingers as if releasing a dove. "Spoils so much upholstery." "Then I will teach my upholstery to swim," Estella replied. He left in that slow way he had, which made departure feel like lingering. When the door shut, Craig set down the pistol he had been holding out of sight and looked at his mother with a fear that had finally learned its own name. "We cannot hold this forever," he said. "Forever is not the assignment." Estella answered. "Today is—" He nodded once, marshalling himself for the smaller war. Lena's new rooms were near enough to the harbor that the gulls acted like neighbors. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Ransom, preferred rules to gossip and made both sound like recipes. "Breakfast is at 7. Opinions after 8, she said. "No gentleman upstairs. You may borrow a novel, but not the ending." Work found Lena because Margaret's name walked ahead, and Mrs. Priest's did not open doors so much as keep them from closing. Linens to mend. A bundle of shirts for a clerk who worked himself into holes. A parlor in need of someone to sit and look like the 5th chair belonged again. When nausea finally ceased its ambushes entirely, Lena discovered a startling thing. Hunger that had no fear tethered to it. Some afternoons she walked to the Battery and watched a sky so wide it made the body feel forgiven. She learned to recognize the sheriff's hat in a crowd and to laugh at herself when a shadow turned out to be only a shadow. She learned that safety is not a place but a pattern you practice until it resembles one. One evening, returning by the longer alley because practice keeps habits supple, she saw a man waiting by Margaret's old door. He practiced looking uncurious and failed. He did not see her. She touched the key in her pocket and kept walking until her breath remembered it was not prey. That night she dreamt of the plantation for the first time in weeks. Not the house, not the grave, but the laundry steam where she used to hide edges. When she woke, her pillow was damp and her jaw notched with the ache of having held silence in her sleep. She rose, washed, and went to Mrs. Ransom's kitchen where bread steamed like a promise. "Eat," Mrs. Ransom said, and the word was a benediction without ceremony. On the plantation, March shed its disguise and spoke plainly. A wind came up that made the char line on the corridor look like a map. The Oaks bent with the practiced courtesy of elders, surviving another sermon. Estella's cough turned cornered. Eliza put a hand to her back and felt heat that did not belong to the air. "You will lie down," Eliza said. "I will not," Estella said, and lay down. Craig sat by the bed with a book open to a page he never turned. He could read a ledger bleeding into red columns. He could not read his mother's breath. When she slept, he walked the corridor, touched the scorched wall, and made a decision that did not dress itself up. If Hartwell came again with paper too pleased with itself, Craig would meet him on the porch with the kind of courtesy that ends conversations. He told Eliza without telling. She heard the metal in his voice and nodded once, as if the two of them had loaded a wagon no one else could see. "Don't miss," she said. "Not bloodthirsty. Only practical, I won't," he said. "The way a man says, I hope I never have to find out." Hartwell did come by habit, if not by need. He mounted the steps with his elegant boredom, and his hat brim shading his appetite. He opened his mouth for a pleasantry, and found himself looking into a barrel that made all of his vowels small. "Sheriff," Craig said, tone civil as water, "my mother is not receiving anonymous complaints today." Hartwell's eyebrows lifted the way a cat's tail does, interest, not fear. "You would point that at an officer of the county?" "I would point it at a man who thinks a county can be put in his pocket." They stood in a silence that measured distances. Porch to yard, yard to road, road to gallows, gallows back to porch. Then Hartwell smiled as if the entire exchange had been agreeable, and stepped back 2 measured paces. "Your father," he said softly. Almost fond, would have shot by now. "My father," Craig returned. "Would have needed to." Hartwell tipped his hat the smallest necessary degree. "Do be careful with your tapers," he repeated and turned. As he walked away, he added lightly, almost as an extra, "Spring brings winds. Winds bring accidents. It would be a pity." Eliza, who had watched from the shadow of the hall, let out a breath so steady it could have been a line drawn with a ruler. "He ain't finished." "Neither am I," Craig said. That night the house refused sleep to everyone out of fairness. Estella's fever argued out loud. Eliza stitched cool cloths and changed them before they got warm. Craig sat on the landing where he could be a hinge if the door required it. The moon dragged itself over the yard like a coin reluctant to pay a debt. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Estella slept the way people do when the body has warned them it is no longer courteous. In the kitchen, Eliza brewed coffee strong as a decision and poured 2 cups. She handed one to Craig and kept the other as if it could anchor her to the floorboards. "Feels like the storm took a breath," she said. "Storms do that," Craig answered. "It's not kindness. It's physics." Eliza almost smiled. "You ain't your father," she said, as if announcing a fact she had been waiting to confirm. Craig looked at his hands and found them empty. "I am trying not to be." "Trying," Eliza said, "counts." In Charleston, a letter arrived at Mrs. Ransom's addressed to Miss L. in Margaret's tidy hand. "The sheriff has a new hobby," it read. "We have changed our habits accordingly. If you see men wearing questions like cheap cologne, turn left." A fig leaf fell from the envelope like a joke that refused to be heavy. Lena laughed, an actual sound, and put the leaf on the sill where the gulls could be jealous. She walked to the Battery that afternoon and let the wind rearrange her. She had thought freedom would be a shout. It kept announcing itself as breath. On the way home, she passed a church where a choir practiced with the door open. The voices were raw and earnest and imperfect in the way truth is. She stood in the doorway and listened and felt, for a minute that could be entered again later, both forgiven and not in need of it. March ended without burning anything that couldn't be scrubbed or painted. This, on the ledger of miracles, is a line item too often ignored. The house kept its char as a warning and a witness. The sheriff kept his distance as a threat and a promise. The city made room for a woman whose story had learned to walk in sensible shoes, but memory, sharp, persistent, unhousebroken, remained. The year would turn. The oaks would green. Someone would mention a fire as if it were a prophecy. And the past, who keeps its own careful inventory, would look up from its bookkeeping and consider asking for more. For now, though, bread rose. Coffee steamed. A woman in Charleston threaded a needle and did not shake. A man on a porch in Edgefield held a pistol and did not fire. An older woman moved through a house and touched walls as if they were ribs that could still be taught to expand. Mercy, like March, lies. But sometimes it lies in your favor,